This week we will explore the teleological argument for the existence of God. The term teleology refers to purposeful organization, and the argument centers on the idea that the appearance of purposeful organization in the universe is evidence of an intelligent creator, largely because of the association between intelligence and purpose. Broadly speaking, there are two variants of this argument. The first, and older, usually called the argument from design, begins with the fact that there are finite systems in the universe which appear to be ordered to an end, or to show purposeful behavior, but which are not themselves intelligent. A typical example is the human eye. But the argument runs, it is impossible for something to act for an end without intelligent direction. Thus the need for a governing intelligence which orders all things to their appropriate ends. This is essentially Thomas's fifth way. The argument is often restated in terms which makes no reference to purposefulness at all, but simply to the fact of order. In these cases, the argument is called eutaxiological. If you want a relatively straightforward metaphor, one that is often given to illustrate this argument is the idea of finding a watch on the beach. If we find a watch on the beach, we assume that there must, in some place in time, have been a watchmaker. This argument, more popular with critics of the neo-Darwinist synthesis, is very easy to defeat. As Kant pointed out, even if the existence of purposeful organization in the universe is possible only as the work of a creative intelligence, there is no reason why the intelligence in question must be divine, infinite, necessary, and perfect. On the contrary, a finite intellect only infinitesimally superior to the highest created system would suffice. It is, furthermore, no longer clear that the development of ordered or even purposeful systems requires a designing or governing intellect. The Boltzmann order principle provides an adequate account of the way in which finite orders can emerge, and nonlinear thermodynamics, coupled with post-Darwinian evolutionary theory, promise to gradually make sense out of the development of complex organization, life, and intelligence. The design variant of the teleological argument, by itself, therefore, is of very limited value. The second variant of the teleological argument begins from a more difficult premise, namely that the universe as a whole is somehow meaningful and organized, and argues from this premise to the existence of God. An early form of this variant of the teleological argument is Thomas's fourth way, which is worth examining in some detail. The fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things, or the hierarchy which exists in the universe. Among beings, there are some which are more and some less good, some truer and some less true, some more noble and some less noble. But more and less are predicated to different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter insofar as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. There is then something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is most being. For those things that are greatest in truth are considered greatest in being, as Aristotle writes in the Metaphysics. Now the maximum in any genus or category is the cause of everything in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum of heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore there must be something which is to all being the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection. And this, Thomas tells us, we call God. It may at first seem a bit peculiar to think of this argument as beginning from cosmic teleology. Most contemporary variants of the argument, as we will see, begin from another standpoint, namely cosmological fine-tuning and or emergent evolution. Thomas's argument, on the other hand, presupposes a static cosmology in which particular organisms and individuals may grow towards their ends individually, gradually achieving the perfection appropriate to their species, but in which there is no global cosmohistorical evolutionary progress. Once we control for this difference, however, the cosmic teleological character of Thomas's argument becomes apparent. What Thomas is doing, in a very concise summary form, is to begin with the results of the special sciences, which reveal a cosmic hierarchy of forms, mineral, vegetable, animal, rational, etc., each of which has greater powers and thus a higher degree of participation in being than the one which precedes it. This implies, however, a principle of value in terms of which these capacities can be ordered. This principle is being as such, which Thomas elsewhere shows to be convertible with the good, the true, the beautiful, etc. Thomas's formulation uses unfortunate quantitative language, which makes the argument vulnerable to some of the same criticism we lodged against Anselm's form of the ontological argument. Specifically, he claims that any ordered series must have a maximum element, must be bounded from above, thus invoking the as yet unproven Zorn's lemma. This move is unnecessary and tends to draw attention away from the key link in the argument, which is that the ordered series must have a cause. A more detailed consideration of the hierarchized capacities which characterize this series would bring this out. For each of the capacities is itself an ordering to an end. Thermodynamic stability in the case of minerals, nutrition, growth and reproduction in the case of plants, food and mates in the case of animals, and intelligible goods in the case of human beings. As we have seen in the context of Aristotelian science, it is the end which is ultimately the cause of the capacity which is ordered to it, a claim which has been reiterated by evolutionary theory, which suggests that it is emerging opportunities in new ecological niches, and the behaviors which they engender, which form the context in which selection for structures which assist these new behaviors takes place. But since all of the capacities are ways and degrees of participation in being, it is being as such which is the real end they seek, and which is the ultimate cause of their development. In this way, the quantitative language, and thus the difficulties surrounding Zorn's lemma, can be avoided. Contemporary variants of the argument from cosmic teleology generally draw on the phenomenon of cosmological fine-tuning, or what is sometimes called the anthropic cosmological principle. At issue here are a variety of physical constants which are fixed at just precisely the levels necessary for the emergence of life and intelligence. Thus, for example, the relative strength of the various fundamental physical forces, the strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and gravity, the relative mass of the electron and proton, and a wide range of other equally fundamental, if somewhat more obscure, numbers, must be in a very narrow range if stars are to evolve and complex chemistry is to be possible. Were gravity just a little bit stronger, the universe would collapse on itself. If it were just a little bit weaker, gas would never condense to form stars, and stars make possible the formation of the heavy elements which are necessary for complex chemistry and thus for life. Similarly, given the existence of these complex elements, if electromagnetism were just a little stronger, electrons would fall into their atomic nuclei. If it were just a little bit weaker, they would never form part of atoms at all. There are, to be sure, ways to answer the evidence for fine-tuning in ways that did not imply cosmic teleology. The most popular of these involves positing the existence of many worlds with different physical laws and different physical constants, from which our own world has been selected randomly by the purely coincidental fact that it is the only kind of universe that we could perceive. This approach is driven by the many worlds approach to quantum mechanics, which argues that all possible states of quantum systems actually exist, so that at each instant the universe in fact diverges into an infinite number of world lines, each corresponding to a possible quantum state of a single elementary particle. But this approach to quantum mechanics violates a fundamental principle of scientific explanation, what is known as Occam's razor. Such theories multiply beings unnecessarily, positing worlds for which there is otherwise no evidence, in order to explain, or rather explain away, evidence of fine-tuning, which can be explained far more economically in teleological terms. The second fact which is often mobilized in contemporary arguments for cosmic teleology is the phenomenon of emergent organization. By this we mean the fact that over time we witness the development of ever more complex forms of organization, so that the universe as a whole becomes more complex and more highly organized. This suggests that the universe as a whole is evolving towards some end, and were this evolution to continue for an infinite period of time, all logically possible forms of organization would be realized, including a form which is infinite and perfect, that is God. An infinite universe characterized by progressive emergent evolution thus in some sense presupposes the existence of God, who is not merely a product of cosmohistorical evolution, as some God-builders would suggest, but also its final cause. Three main arguments are raised against this line of reasoning. First, some claim that evolution is not progressive, but rather merely horizontal into new ecological niches. This claim is easily defeated when we note that some forms of organization include, and in some cases even comprehend the capacity of other forms of organization, which can thus be regarded as lesser, showing that the system as a whole is hierarchical. Second, there is the question of whether or not cosmic evolution continues into infinity. This is a more difficult and still controversial question. We should note, however, that any universe which produces intelligent systems capable of rising to the idea of God is, in some sense, already ordered to God, at least in terms of its desire. Spiritual disciplines which allow one to become connatural with God by means of caritative wisdom, furthermore, make God really present within the space and time of that universe, quite apart from whether or not cosmohistorical evolution continues into infinity. This, coupled with the interpretation of cosmological fine-tuning cited above, is sufficient to demonstrate not only the existence of God, but also the ultimate meaningfulness of the universe. The third objection arises from the claim that a teleological principle is not necessary in order to explain emergent evolution. We have already noted above that random variation and natural selection for variation, which have survival value, did not by themselves explain the emergence of life in the first place or the development of more complex living systems. Nonlinear thermodynamics and post-Darwinian evolution do a better job of explaining how emergent evolution takes place, but they still do not explain why. Simpler structures, which require less energy input to build and maintain, are far more probable and in some ways more adaptive. And if survival value is measured in terms of population size, simpler organisms would, in general, seem to be the better adapted. Yet matter manifests this powerful drive towards complex organization. The uphill struggle of the universe against the energy gradient and against the laws of probability can be explained only in terms of some attractive principle which draws matter from potency to act, from mere possibility, into the rich diversity of increasingly improbable and complex, high-energy forms of organization, such as those we observe in the contemporary universe. And since it is the diversity and increasing complexity of different forms of organization, and not simply the fact of the universe in general, which we are attempting to explain here, we must conclude that each form is ordered to, and in fact exists because of, the attractive principle which draws it from potency to act. Such a principle, furthermore, must itself require no further principle of explanation. It must, as we have noted in our discussion of the cosmological proof, be infinite, necessary, and perfect, and thus divine. Where do you stand? Do you believe that the existence of complex, purposeful organization requires an intelligent creator? That a universe ordered to the emergence of such organization implies the existence of God? Why or why not? And what difference, if any, does it make for the way in which we live our lives?